Testing. Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes. Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can open if you want. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing.
All right, Marco, can you bring one for everybody? Thank you. Quite a good turnout for this bag. Quite a good turnout for this bag. We normally don't get this many. So, what's the Māori name for the New Zealand alternative? AUKUS. Right. Did you get the slides? Is that good?
Oh, I don't need them.
Right. Well, where are you going to want to stand? Because behind there.
Is there papers on it? Yeah.
Yes. Okay. There he comes.
I can see that.
Okay. You can bung them up on the table if you like. Okay. Okay, let's go. Radio, that's it. Moving on. Oh, right, yeah, good. Tēnā koutou katoa, tuarua. Ki ngā mate, haere, haere, haere atu rā. E mihi ana te mana whenua o Ngāti Toa me Taranaki whānui, kia tātou e tau nei kia ora. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Mike Smith. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome members of Te Kauaka, the New Zealand Alternative, to speak to us about the issue of whether or not New Zealand should be part of the AUKUS initiative. And before we start, Tawhina will give us a karakia.
Tēnā tātou tuake ki te mihi hoki ki te mana whenua te Aotearoa whānui, nei rā te mihi kia koutou ko aia hau he uri tēnei no Ngāti Hori o here taunga no reira ko au mihi atu nei kia koutou o te takiwā nei. Tēnā tātou. Me karakia. Mai te tupua, mai te tawhito, mai te kāhui o ngā riki, mai tawhiwhiki ngā tua. O I katakina te Māori, ko te Māori ahoa no ki runga ki e nei taura, ki runga ki e nei tauira. Kia tau te Māori ki runga ki e nei tama he tukuna no te whai ororo, tāne te wai ora. Tēnei te matatau kai ke whakatū tā rewa ki te rangi, uhi, wero tau mai te Māori, haumi e, hui e, pai.
Ngā Okay, so tonight we have three speakers with us. Nicky Hager and Arama Rata, and Dr. Arama Rata, I should say, and Dr. Marco de Jong, all from the Te Kauaka Collective. So the batting order is Nicky goes first, then Arama, and then Marco. So Nicky, you can have which mic you like. Yeah.
Kia ora tātou. We're on a gradual tour around the country to talk about AUKUS, but this is different for me because as soon as I'm in Wellington, it's not a whole lot of people I don't know. It's basically a whole lot of people who are old friends. So good to be with you, is what I'm saying. New Zealand has a proud and long-term tradition when it comes to alliances of never consulting the public before we go into them, almost total lack of transparency for the rest of the time, and except when it suits them, excluding the public from all the major decisions, and often Parliament as well, and the government. And so, that includes, of course, the Five Eyes Alliance, the one that covers intelligence operations, but it includes a whole lot of Five Nation cooperations in military and technology areas between the different members of the five English-speaking nations: the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Britain. And it's in that proud tradition that we now have AUKUS has arrived. And as you'll hear, it's being brought to New Zealand not as something which we're going to be fully informed, but more something where we're being misled and left out of the decisions. I kind of started to take great notice of this when the Minister of Defence, Andrew Little, appeared on the Weekend Current Affairs program a couple of months ago and talked about the idea of New Zealand joining AUKUS. I just want to check everyone knows AUKUS. So AUKUS is this ghastly mouthful of a word. A for Australia, UK for Britain, and US for the United States of America. And what he said was, this with that ugly new word, he said the following: AUKUS is primarily a technology exchange agreement. In other words, that's kind of like the founding lie of what we're getting ourselves into. It totally misrepresents what's at stake and why we might be worried about what's going on. It makes it sound like something like a university exchange or something, or maybe some scientific cooperation. In fact, as most of you will know already, the primary feature of the AUKUS alliance or agreement or arrangement, or whatever it's going to be called, is it's designed to be to be an anti-China military coalition. And it's part of a dangerous escalation of aggressive war talk and provocative military operations that are going on in East Asia at the moment. And so it's far from being a benign and uncontroversial thing. It is deeply dangerous and extremely controversial, except that the people who are writing the scripts for the minister and writing the cabinet papers, as I'll explain in a little while, are trying not to let us know that. The public messages from US officials who have come to help persuade our government have been equally evasive. When Kurt Campbell, the White House National Security Advisor, visited New Zealand earlier this year, he said, quote, "We've heard clearly a New Zealand ambition to advance its work in cutting-edge technologies. The United States wants to support in that work constructively." So, go scientific collaboration. He was actually here, of course, to lobby for and joining in the anti-China alliance. And this is not sort of a speculation. As soon as you get out of the realm of a tiny little bubble of PR meant for the public, the story is very clear. There's this great website in the United States which brings together all the transcripts of all the meetings, Senate hearings, congressional hearings, subcommittees of this and that, of every word that's spoken in them. So it's very easy to search your way through. And I just want to give you a couple of quotations from them about what they're saying about AUKUS at the moment. So first of all, 2 weeks after AUKUS was announced, here's a hearing of the US House of Representatives Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Non-Proliferation, where the senior ranking Republican member was speaking. And he says, quote, "The United States and like-minded allies and partners are aggressively building an array of new plurilateral groups like the Quad and AUKUS, which are essential to mitigate threats in the Indo-Pacific." And what were the threats, he said? China. Or, in the US Committee on Armed Services, the US Indo-Pacific Command commander, like the military man who controls the largest area of the world for the US military, said this last year: "I've spent the vast majority of my time strengthening and enhancing our relationships with allies and partners, our number one asymmetric advantage. Instrumental to these efforts are AUKUS, the Quad, and engagement with ASEAN." And the target, of course, was again China. So this is the environment in which we are being told this fanciful and deceitful story about the reasons why we might like to join that coalition of countries. When Andrew Little introduced the idea, which was a few months ago, he said that what New Zealand was being invited, what was being discussed that New Zealand might do was joining what's called the second pillar of AUKUS. And if you heard this, you might wonder what a second pillar is. Well, there is no such thing as a second pillar. It's a word that's been invented, and what it really means, it's a phrase that's been invented, and what it really means is second tier, which is actually another proud tradition in New Zealand of being the junior and least influential member of any alliances, military or intelligence, that we join. So it's got another strong tradition behind it. The other name that's been used for AUKUS in the New Zealand context has been that we're looking at the non-nuclear parts of the AUKUS agreement. And this is clearly designed for consumption by the New Zealand public. And what it's saying is, we're not going to get nuclear submarines here, we're just going to do other non-nuclear stuff, like participate in a possible war with China, which of course is ridiculous. As we all know, as everyone in this room I'm sure agrees, it is strongly in the interests of small countries like New Zealand to have as good relationships as possible with all countries, and that entering into a military build-up against a massive country like China a confrontation between two nuclear weapons powers is completely against our interests. And it is doubly stupid when that country that we're looking at is our greatest trading partner. But this is actually another proud tradition, because when we think back over the years, for example, the invasion of Iraq, what happens there is that the same alignment of countries enter into these things. So what happened in Iraq? The United States was first, Britain was second, Australia was third, and New Zealand was supposed to be fourth or fifth. But because of Helen Clark, we didn't join. But that's the natural order. The natural order in our foreign policy, the one which isn't discussed and isn't reviewed and isn't made explicit, is that there's this old colonial era alignment where the United States and Britain stick together, and then Britain brings some of its old colonies along to bulk out the numbers, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And that's really the great fight of our times. That's the great fight in foreign policy, is whether what the public thinks is happening, which is becoming a more modern, a more independent, a nuclear-free, a resolver of disputes rather than the fueling disputes. Which of those visions we have for our country, or whether we drop back into being one of the smallest, the most junior of the five colonial nations. And that, of course, is what you probably know this, but one of the things when military people talk in New Zealand, why they're buying new ships, why they're having a military exercise with these countries or those countries, is they use the word interoperability. Now, interoperability is kind of like a linguist or a PR person designed a word which would least convey any meaning when you heard it, like interoperability. But what it means is, the very important meaning of the word interoperability is that things are being done, equipment is being bought, training is happening, joint exercises are happening, so that our armed forces are ready and equipped to slot into an Anglo-American war. And so interoperability is a sinister, terrible, backwards thing to be doing, because the future it's working for is one which most New Zealanders don't agree with. But that's the banner of a lot of our military planning and operations. That's also the reason why the subject of defence spending, which we don't think about very much in domestic politics, is very big in alliance politics, because it really matters to the great powers, the United States and Britain in this case, that little countries like New Zealand are pouring enough money and having enough contributions to make when the next war happens. And so you'll find that when a visiting American official or such person comes to New Zealand, it's a big deal how much we're spending on military. And it's not because we're going to spend it to help people if there are floods or to go out into the Pacific because of climate change. It's to have the equipment and then more of the equipment for when they next go to war, and expect that we will naturally follow on their coattails. And so why are we joining this at all? Why are we even talking about it? Well, the first reason, I think, is because our government is being fed exactly the same pap as the public is being sold, which is about that this is somehow going to help us have better, newer, more modern, more exciting technology for our military. It's a completely fake argument. The second reason I've already alluded to, which is that in the minds of some people, the automatic setting for New Zealand when there is a war, when our Anglo-American allies are thinking of war, is to say we'll come too. But the third, and I think the main reason why we are in any risk of joining this alliance is something which is to do with something which is fundamentally wrong with our public service, with the setup of our foreign policy paid officials and organisations. And this is the thing I want to emphasise most, because I don't think that Chris Hipkins is thinking, while I'm Prime Minister, I really want to get us closer to NATO. Or, while I'm Prime Minister, I think we should get into that new anti-Chinese alliance. No way. I think you'd have trouble finding anyone in the government who thinks that. This is not this is not how things happen in New Zealand. This is not the way decisions evolve and then get made in New Zealand. The way it actually happens is that there are generations in those proud traditions I talked about, of public servants from foreign affairs mostly, from foreign affairs and trade, and from the military, who deeply believe that the best way that they can serve the interests of New Zealand is to do whatever their traditional allies say. Their allies, not ours. And this is a huge obstacle, this is a huge problem, because what the result of this is not that they put up a point of view which the Labour government or the national government will reject or accept, is that they lobby and lobby and lobby and bend and push. They're the main lobbyists in New Zealand for the perpetuation of that five-nation alliance, which year by year suits our country less and less. And just to illustrate this, I just wanted to talk about, just show off this cabinet paper, which Marco artfully extracted out from the military, from Foreign Affairs, about AUKUS, which, needless to say, is nearly all redacted, but there are some bits which aren't redacted, and if you read between the lines, there's actually a very important story there. So I just want to finish on this, if I can read it. So the important thing when you read something like a Foreign Affairs lobbying document like this is that you read between the lines, as I say, between the lines of what's going on. So what they don't say is, government, do you want us to pursue negotiations with Australia, Britain and the United States about possibly joining a military alliance against China? You laugh, but wouldn't you think that's what you do? No. What actually happens is we get the typical cabinet paper which doesn't ask for your decision. All it asks from the minister is to note various things. I'll give you an example. So here's the recommendations on when the AUKUS first came out. And the ministers were asked to note. So one of the things they were asked to note was that AUKUS provides for increased cooperation among AUKUS partners across a range of emerging security and technology capabilities. And then they're asked to note that officials will continue to engage with AUKUS partners with a view to better understanding the partnership and maintaining visibility over areas of particular interest to Aotearoa, New Zealand. Now, this is a Wellington audience here, so I don't have to spell this out very much. But what is actually going on is they're saying, we're not asking you whether we go off and try to negotiate with the Americans and the British and the Australians about participation. We're just getting you to note that officials will continue to engage with AUKUS partners to better understand the partnership and to maintain visibility over areas of particular interest to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so it goes on. In a follow-up paper, they said, there has been growing, this is a year later, there's been growing momentum on Pillar 2 of AUKUS. Pillar 2 concentrates on accelerating technologies and capabilities and blacked out. The AUKUS partners have indicated to New Zealand that there is in principle agreement that there will be some degree of opening up of Pillar 2 to key partners, if you're lucky enough to be a key partner, of course. And so in this kind of pathetic way, ministers who are thinking about everything else apart from AUKUS and the crises in their parties and the coming election and the fundraising stall they've got to go to on Saturday and they're back in their electorate and all the rest of it are told, don't engage your brain on AUKUS, it's fine. We're just noting a few things. There's no decisions to make yet. We'll look after this. And then later they'll say, as you noted, as we pointed out to you and as you accepted on this date, and this date, we've been investigating this with our allies and they say this is what we can do. And eventually it's a very small jump and it's quite hard not to take that jump, which is the point of this kind of bureaucratic manoeuvring. And what do you do about it? Well, you can't leave them to it. You have to talk about it, we have to discuss it, and we have to disagree with it, which is why we're here tonight.
Thanks very much, Nikki. Arama, the floor is yours.
Tēnā tātou, he ru tēnei no Manipoto, no Taranaki, no Ngārewa Hine, no Te Aotearoa hoki, ko Arama tōku ingoa. Thanks for that opening and thank you for welcoming us here. It's really great to see such a packed room to talk about such an ugly acronym. I wanted to share a few thoughts that I have kind of been having with some friends from the US and from Canada. And we were chuckling because as you may know, Canada is also considering joining the AUKUS Pact. And we were laughing because if Canada joins, then we'll get caucus. And then if New Zealand joins at the end, we get Caucasians, which we think is great because then it tells you exactly what it is, right? So we laughed about Canada and New Zealand being a bit salty about being left out of the deal. But of course, we should save our tears for France because they really wanted it to be fuckus. But that didn't quite play out for them. So Nikki has kind of covered already how bureaucrats are manoeuvring our decision makers to get behind AUKUS. And I wanted to carry on from that to talk about how it is that the public are being brought into these discussions and how consent is being manufactured amongst us through the media. As we know, we see lots of these stories that just are basically China bad, or the little variation of that, which is China good, but at what cost, right? If you actually Google China, but at what cost, you'll see just dozens and dozens and dozens of headlines. It's very cookie cutter stuff. They're not actually very creative, and they tend to like copy each other. So everyone in the Anglosphere comes out with similar kind of iterations of the same fake news. So it's been quite interesting kind of seeing the ways in which people are arguing for us to get behind AUKUS. You know, I've heard Andrew Little talking about this massive military build-up that we're seeing in China, the increasing assertiveness and aggression of China, the idea that China can't rise peacefully. And like John Mearsheimer has this whole YouTube video where he talks about why it is that there is no possible way that China could rise peacefully. And what do you think he uses as evidence? An analysis of the US since the 1700s. And to look at what they're actually talking about when they're talking about military build-up, one thing that Andrew Little said was, Chinese military spending has increased since the 1990s tenfold, which sounds pretty bad, right? But when we look at their GDP, we see that the GDP of China has increased since the 1990s 40-fold. So actually, they're not keeping up with their own increase in wealth. There's a lot of talk about all of these overseas bases that China has, and all of these new bases that they're building in the South China Sea. So this is a very intelligent audience, I can see. Does anybody know how many overseas bases China has? Hey, one in Djibouti, yep, and then about 7 in the South China Sea that kind of count, right? But they're really just maybe offshore might be a better word than overseas for those military bases. And Tibet, okay. And then how many overseas military bases does the US have? 75 was an answer. Chuck a zero on the end, and you got the right answer. 750 overseas military bases, 400 in Asia Pacific, and 300 in East Asia. And I'm not saying any of that to say that I think China, the military presence of China elsewhere is cool. I don't. But I think what this does expose is the Western propaganda that is very much embedded in the stories that we receive here. If we look at GDP, China spends 1.7% of their GDP on military spending, and the US spends 3.5%, so that's more than double if you're not a statistician. Spending per capita, China spends $203 per year, New Zealand 697, the US 1,231. Sorry, that was Australia. Australia 1,231, the US 2,405. So more than 10 times per capita. Hey, we've got a smart audience. So who knows a country that spends more than the US per capita? It's not hard to guess, really. Israel, yes, Israel and Qatar. Yeah. And some people might say, well, you know, China's a really, really big country, so is it appropriate to be kind of making comparisons based on a per capita basis? Maybe not. So let's look at total spending, shall we? And this is probably familiar to a lot of you, but total spending 2023 on the military, maybe this is forecasted, we have China at 252 billion, the US at 778 billion, accounting for approximately 40% of the global total military spending, and the US military spending is larger than the next 10 biggest spenders combined. So if we're talking about military spending, if we're talking about military bases in the Pacific, then, you know, Marco and I kind of see China as quite irrelevant in that context. There are also arguments around, you know, why we should join AUKUS that we'll see in the media that have lines in them around we need to preserve the rules-based international order, which has been so good for us. And, you know, this international order is something we need to uphold so that might doesn't equal right. And as an Indigenous person of the Pacific, that's just ridiculous and insulting. This idea that we have shared values with the US, okay, sure, or appealing to arguments based on human or Indigenous rights. And again, as an Indigenous Pacific person, if we are interested truly in Indigenous rights and in human rights, we would not be arming, we would be disarming the genocidal, imperialist, sociopathic Anglosphere. And now I'm going to talk about how our media goes about doing this. And there's this really funny video that my niece showed me by these Australian lads, Boy, I think it was, where they talk about how, was that? It's a good one. If you're trying to get young people into these ideas. But what they talk about is how you might look at the same concept across different contexts, but it has a different name. So if it's happening in the West by white people, then it's called campaign financing. If there's a Chinese person involved, it's called corruption. If the CPC is doing it, it's called interference. If the US is doing it, it's called soft power. Sorry, it's just, I mean, it's laughable. We also see this kind of playbook, the way in which they go about manufacturing consent. So we see these sensational headlines, and then it becomes viral and memes are created about it. And then maybe some days or maybe some months later, there'll be like a little disclaimer saying, well, that wasn't quite true, or it wasn't the full story. And this way the media can claim that they're doing due diligence, but of course the disclaimer is not disseminated widely. And so people still go on believing in that original headline. And there have been so many examples of this, and I want it to be participatory. So who can think of an example of a story like that, where we see that kind of playbook in action? Go on now. Oh, I don't know this one. No, he doesn't want it. Doesn't want to educate me. Yep, at the back. The Solomon Island potential, maybe one day, military base. Yeah. Let's be more concerned about what China might do than what the US is actually doing. Yeah. Spy balloon, my personal favorite. Yep. So for the longest time, there was all of this hype about China is spying on the US, and look how it hovered over these particular military bases and important strategic sites. Well, where in the US does not have a military presence, surely? Other examples, we've got this is not China related, but, same. The Russian spy at RNZ, did you hear about him? Absolutely ridiculous. My personal favorite is, because these themes are around spying, they're around interference, but they're also around intellectual property. We see a lot of those themes coming across, and my favorite intellectual property media story is the one about did you hear the one? Did you hear the one about the Chinese stealing the kiwi fruit? That's a good one, eh? What did they used to be called, Mike?
Chinese gooseberry.
Oh, that's interesting, eh? How does that work? So we've got all these people at Zespri saying, like a villain from what's that show with the Dick Dastardly? Hey, we stole it fair and square. So the argument is, like, when you put it to somebody like, but, where did this fruit come from? It comes from China. They say, oh, yes, but we improved it. We improved it. In the couple of 100 years that we've had it here, we improved it. But there's no acknowledgement that in all of the many, many thousands of years that China has had this fruit, that they improved it, right? Because property is for white people. There's so many stories like this. I could go on and on. I think even stories, like there was Jian Yang, who was accused of being a spy. He was a person within the National Party, and so there were major headlines about this potential spy. But then the story just falls away. They say, we're going to investigate it, and you never hear the result. You never hear the findings from those investigations. So we're all left just thinking there's a lot of interference happening, there's spying going on. Even things like Meng Foon coming under heaps of scrutiny for his campaign contributions. The original headlines are trying to have us believe that he's politically biased. And then later we find out, no, he actually donated to National as well as Labour. But that part of the story gets dropped and we keep going back to the original headline again. So, is China really trying to influence New Zealand? Yes. Is the US trying to influence New Zealand? Yes. And they're doing a much better job of it. So I think we need to be very vigilant. The call here is for us to resist being recruited into this Anglo alliance, this Caucasian suicide pact, as I like to call it, and not just resisting AUKUS, but resisting NATO and resisting any attempt for us to be dragged into a war with China, be that hot, cold, or nuclear. We need to be centering ourselves in our place in the world, in the Pacific. We need to learn from our elders, and we need to talk across generations, because there's a lot of success that has been had by older generations in this type of movement, because these types of challenges have been faced by us before. We know that when we do actually work together and create movements, being a small country, we can actually achieve some change. And so we all need to be activated in this and link all of our local struggles with that broader vision for a nuclear-free and independent Pacific. So we have to oppose AUKUS. We have a petition. You can Google oppose AUKUS and sign our petition. That'd be great. And if you have any platforms, if you're part of any unions or parties, then please share it on those bigger platforms so that we can try to get more signatures. I'm going to hand over to Marco now, who's going to continue on drawing out what this kind of Pacific-led foreign policy could look like. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thanks, Arama. Just grab my water. I'll probably yell.
Try that other microphone, because that one you've got to speak right into. Try the other one.
How's that better? Okay. Talofa lava, mā lola sua fua maua, malalangi mā, ala o ngā o mākou, whawhatai mole awa noa. Thanks for having me. My name is Jong. I'm a Pacific historian, and I study the regional environmental movement in the Pacific, SPREP, and the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific movement. Today, I want to talk to you about the implications of the AUKUS Alliance for Pacific regionalism and Aotearoa's place in the region. I want to start by saying that AUKUS signals a dramatic departure in the politics of Pacific regionalism, because it involves the complete integration of Australia into the structure of American hegemony. And through that, it has dramatic ramifications for the mandate of the Pacific Islands Forum, and the, I might change mics. Is this crackly? Okay. It has grave implications for nuclear non-proliferation and regional sovereignty. My suggestion today is that the AUKUS choice of defence over diplomacy, of militarism over multilateralism, is immoral and works to condemn the Pacific. I say this because we must act in the full understanding that the Pacific Ocean is becoming, once again, a sacrifice zone, a military buffer, and climate disaster area. The superpower scramble for influence is constructing our ocean as the site of a future war. International failure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions means many islands will be uninhabitable by the end of the century. Unless, of course, we halve GHG emissions by 2025. As Pacific people, we must arrest this trajectory before our ocean ceases to exist as a Pacific or island place. Now, hawks in Washington and Canberra have this intelligence. They see a Pacific region that is facing deepening disaster. But instead of committing to the alternative security vision held by Pacific nations, which is centered on climate response and socioeconomic resilience, and is very clearly outlined in Boy and Bikatawa declarations, and a long history of ocean governance regimes like the PNA, the parties to the Nauru Agreement, the Treaty of Rarotonga, the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone, the Wangani and the Mir Conventions. All that's which is reflected in the 2050 Blue Pacific Strategy. They have instead chosen to adopt a securitized lens that sees the, quote, Indo-Pacific only in imperial terms. The region features centrally in war-making as a space of transit, stationing and testing of outsourced nuclear risk. Our islands have become strategically important, or continue to be strategically important, but Pacific people continue to be collateral in this vision. We must remember that Pacific nations heard about AUKUS at the same time as New Zealand did, the same time as the media did. We were not consulted. This warmongering is outmoded and ill-equipped for a contemporary reality where multiple global crises require rapid de-escalation and the restoration of multilateralism. Not only are there no winners in a conflict that would take us beyond limits, but this provocatory, preparatory militarism jeopardizes our ability in the Pacific to address growing wealth inequality, increasing food insecurity, and the climate crisis. AUKUS is, in a very real sense, an existential threat to Pacific ways of being. Now, I'll turn now to the implications for Aotearoa and how this is being sold to us, and also what the declassified documents say about Pacific regionalism and New Zealand's response, or New Zealand's kind of platform about it. And I'll take two passages of text. One is from the joint Defence MFAT briefing to the ministers a month after AUKUS, and the second is from about March this year. The first one reads, Aotearoa New Zealand welcomes increased engagement by the UK and the US in our region. We're a Pacific nation and we view foreign policy and security developments through the lens of what is in the best interest of the region. We understand the AUKUS arrangement to focus on enhanced capability in security and defence technology areas and to be complementary to, rather than supplanting, existing arrangements with other partners, including Five Eyes Quad and ASEAN-centric architecture. There are likely to be significant opportunities to cooperate with AUKUS beyond the submarines, particularly in the cyber and artificial intelligence areas. It's 2021. Now, March this year. New Zealand is a Pacific nation. Reflecting our region's legacy of nuclear testing, we remain committed to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Redacted. Pacific countries face a complex and growing array of challenges, including the impacts of climate change and increasingly contested strategic environment. As a region, we have agreed that the security responses within the Pacific should come first and foremost from within our Pacific family. As a member of the Pacific Islands Forum, Australia is a part of that Pacific family. Let me be very clear. New Zealand is being assigned, but also co-designing itself in the war-making activities at AUKUS. The language about Australia being a member of the Pacific family, having sold its sovereignty, and being a conduit for deepening American hegemony, and the idea that this is in the best interest of the region, is a dramatic betrayal of the Pacific. How could they write that? But it is nothing new. Historically, New Zealand has exploited its ambivalent position between the Pacific and the Western powers. This moment has clear parallels with the 80s in respect to nuclear testing and nuclear waste dumping in the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty of Rarotonga and its sister convention, the Noumea Convention. And declassified documents reveal that Australia and New Zealand colluded with the United States to preempt proposals of, quote, a more radical or impractical nature. And of course, we know that the Treaty of Rarotonga doesn't preclude US transit or stationing of nuclear weapons. But the language, that New Zealand and Australia brought the intelligence that the Pacific was perhaps going to mobilize on the question of port visits, and that the US had to soften its approach on the Noumea Convention because this was so serious to ANZUS joint security interests that it had the capacity to spill over into other areas and could affect ANZUS efforts to keep the region pro-Western. This was a briefing by Chris Beebe to Paul Wolfowitz. How is this happening now? There is a concerning trend of the New Zealand and Australian governments co-opting the language of climate justice and Indigenous ocean stewardship to securitize the region. Blue Pacific framing features in New Zealand's joint declarations with the US, references made to blue issues like maritime boundaries, humanitarian relief, fishing as a wash for military spendings. My favourite example is the ADF's Black Rock Peacekeeping and Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief Camp in Fiji, which is going to be great when they expand their RSE scheme to include Fijians in the military. New Zealand's particular tactic, as Nikki said, is to use our nuclear-free mythology as a cover for tacit support of militarism. We must remember that when New Zealand went nuclear-free in '87, it did so exclusively, without the rest of the region and without the independence elements of the broader movement that propelled or gave our own anti-nuclear stance a broader context and remove from is strategically impotent. This, in effect, constitutes a shadow foreign policy where the public is communicated to with messaging that is entirely at odds with both the reality and in defiance of the mandate. Aotearoa draws its international standing from its place in the Pacific. Any claims to power are Pacific claims. We need to establish principled difference from superpower politics and contribute to the rebuilding of Pacific regionalism in ways consistent with regional priorities, our Pacific identity, and Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Rather than subscribing blindly to the neo-Anzac delusion, we ought to fulfill our diplomatic potential as Aotearoa. We called this movement Matika Hawaiki, Rise Hawaiki. But the original name for the movement, or one idea, was Losing Hawaiki. And it was called that with the understanding that if we look very clearly at what Aotearoa New Zealand stands to lose by subscribing to this trajectory, is we stand to lose as Pasifika, as Māori, Indigenous connections. Hawaiki, the place of origin and return, the shared heavens. We decided that that was very pessimistic. And so instead, we now have Matika Hawaiki, Rise Hawaiki, like the fish hook. We go against the trajectory that is being told to us, suppression, subsuming of our islands, and draw instead on the deep genealogical legacies and the ties over water with blood that we have, that suggest that we have the power to bring our islands up from the sea, like Maui. Honestly, I ask you this last question. If we lose Hawaii, where will we go when we die?
Whawhatai lava, Marco, mihi nui, Arama, and thank you very much, Nikki. Right, time for questions. I've got a mic here that perhaps Philip or somebody can come and help me with. Is anybody like to start? Great, thanks. Right, anyone care to start? Or question, statement? Yes.
I want to thank all the speakers for great presentations. And yes, it certainly is a very tragic time that New Zealand is betraying its initial great impulse with the nuclear-free movement. Now, I did find something that is quite incredible today. Maybe somebody else has read it today. Dated on pills and irritations. Good news on nukes. US can't sell Australia nuclear subs. Now, can you believe this is an example of the incredible deception and well, incompetence of the United States. They deceived the whole the region about this. They can't actually sell any subs for a long time because they don't even have enough themselves. And they can only make about 1.5 a year. And of course, they've got seriously wars challenging Russia, challenging China at the same time. Isn't this fabulous?
I'm not sure that you're right on that one. I wouldn't.
This is an article by somebody who knows about it.
It's all right. I think Kay was referring to an article in Pills and Irritations, which is a website that I would recommend to everybody, actually. It's written by John Menadue, who's a former Australian diplomat and has a regular series of commenters on the sorts of issues we're discussing at the moment. So, thank you, Kay. Anyone else with a...
During your address, you used an expression which began with genocidal, and there were about four words used one after the other. Could you repeat those to us, please, and tell us what you meant by that expression? That was quite complicated, and if you could take us through each of those elements, I'd be really grateful.
Thank you. Thank you. I felt like that moment kind of just went thud on the ground, so I'm happy to revisit it. I wrote it down. Where did I write it? I said we should be disarming rather than arming the genocidal, imperialist, sociopathic Anglosphere. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, the UK, who have been responsible for many genocides across the world, who have been very much a part of ongoing imperialism, the extraction of wealth from the global south, and sociopathic, meaning completely without any regard for what is morally correct. I actually Googled that before I got up here, sociopathic, meaning I had to borrow Marco's phone. I didn't want to use it without knowing exactly what it meant. And, you know, let's be real about it. If we want to have this charade that something like AUKUS is about human rights, or that it's about Indigenous rights, then it shouldn't only be one area of the world whose human rights or Indigenous rights are put under scrutiny. And the Anglosphere has a lot of Indigenous blood on its hands. So that's why I use those terms. Thanks.
Thank you. Others? Yes. Thank you. Can I just borrow your watch?
My name is Russell Tregoning, and I really enjoyed the presentations. I'd like to ask a question of each of the panelists to tell me why the Asia Pacific is now called the Indo-Pacific.
Right, who goes first?
The rhetoric will be that it better accounts for the priorities of the Quad, right? Because India stretches around the Indo-Pacific. But I think it's because they want to decenter the Asian part of it to stress their own mandate. I think as a Pacific person, it's very concerning terminology because no Pacific person thinks of themselves as part of the Indo-Pacific. And because, as I explained, you know, AUKUS runs roughshod over the mandate of the Pacific Islands Forum to determine its own strategic priorities because the AUKUS push is accompanied by this aggressive bilateral strategy that we're seeing with the US-PNG Security Pact and the reopening of these embassies in places that were abandoned immediately after World War II, along with all the munitions. I think that we have to worry about that framing because the Pacific has its own understanding of the moana, the blue Pacific continent, and the associated collective security within that region. The Indo-Pacific as a way to balance, in their words, or constrain or contain, in other people's words. China runs counter to the Pacific blue continent strategic vision of friends to all, enemies to none. So I think that's my take on Indo-Pacific versus blue Pacific. Others might have other ones about precisely how it came about, but I would suggest that, yeah, it's to do with the Quad.
Thanks, Russell. in the world of diplomacy, one of the things that goes on, I was talking about the use of words and the way that cabinet papers get written and shifted over time. But one of the big parts of diplomacy is the use of code words, which show your allegiance. They speak, this kind of, the more clear ones are kind of like-minded nations and, you know, traditional friends and stuff. But what you see with the Indo-Pacific is that basically it means, it's not describing a region, it's describing an alignment. It essentially means we're on the American side here. I know that sounds crass, but that's exactly what it means. And the people who insert that, and from a New Zealand perspective, Asia Pacific is a very meaningful term which we have no need of changing. But when the foreign affairs person writes Indo-Pacific into a briefing paper, or particularly into a prime ministerial speech, what's being seen, what's being heard loud and clear in the embassies of the Western powers is they're being pro-American. It's basically what it means. And there are other examples like this, but that's a classic one.
Yes, I'll just add a couple of bits to that. I think it's fundamentally, as I understand it, a military term, and it refers to the Indo-Pacific Command, which is the United States command that operates out of Hawaii. And it's interesting that the briefing papers to the 2017 incoming government from Foreign Affairs talked about the Asia-Pacific. The briefing papers to the 2020 incoming government talked about the Indo-Pacific. And in between, we had a bit of a shift, shall we say, in the direction of foreign policy, certainly at the top. Okay, that's a bit from me. Anyone else? Yes.
Thank you. I'll have to hold the microphone up like I tell everybody else to do that, like an ice cream. I'm going home tonight to write a letter to the Sokokagai group, who have for a number of years had school children talking around Hiroshima Day about nuclear issues. There will be 1,000 this year. There always are. And they're not the only group that actually do it. Now, they're young people who actually manage it themselves. They stand up and talk about what they want over nuclear issues in particular. They're not the only group. You could say the Baha'is have had 14 or was it 12? 12 different forums around the country on race relations and so forth. And that has been going on for a long time, and the police have been assisting them in it. I think we have to be reasonable in saying that, yes, New Zealand is pretty much committed to nuclear issues. I'm involved, well, I'm about the only New Zealander that ever listens to ICAN in Australia. ICAN in Australia focus very, very much on trying to get the treaty accepted by Australia. And Tilman Ruth, who was the co-founder of it, actually spoke in Melbourne last week, but he didn't think Australia would ever get there. They may. They're very, very hopeful. They see that as the most important thing for Australia to do at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't think that was a question, but okay. It's all right. It's perfectly okay. Anyone else? Yes.
Kia ora, talofa bula. My name's Leo. I just wanted, not a question, just a clarification on something you were talking about, Marco. I didn't quite understand. It was about, you mentioned RSC and potentially induction of Fijian soldiers into a space. Does that sound familiar from what you were
I was referring to, this is interesting. I think there's some subtle lobbying. Maybe a month ago, I think he's the Attorney General, Tongani Valu, came out and said that he was in talks, or he advocated for an arrangement, not unlike the Fiji has with the British, to do with residency for service in the military. And my immediately alarm bells went off in my mind, because we know that our own Defence Force and the Australian Defence Force struggles to keep its personnel. And so you fear that the same mentality of RSE, where Pacific people are used as expendable labour, as bodies, could be used in that sense. Yeah, and so I thought that it was a subtle test balloon almost, what Tonginivalu was doing, and that it wasn't necessarily his initiative. But I think that maybe I think we should watch that space, see what the Australians do, and be very concerned about it. Because, just broadly what it would mean if Pacific nations that do not currently have militaries, like Samoa, for example, it could be extended to police sharing and things like that, and militarism could be re-exported back to Pacific nations with all of the attendant problems.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Right, well, sorry. Yes.
Kia ora and ngā mihi, Tom White. A few months ago I wanted to find out whether our Prime Minister could commit this country to war on his own behalf. And I wasn't able to find out, nobody I knew was able to tell me, so I thought I'd write to the Prime Minister and ask him myself. He didn't answer me, he didn't reply, so I wrote another email to him saying, under the Official Information Act, could you please let me know if you're able to commit to this country to a war, perhaps with China. I haven't had a reply back since that. So I wondered, Nikki, or if anyone else knows, is he in a position to declare war on a country without going to the people, the Parliament, or even the Cabinet?
Thank you. That's a very good question, which I am not 100% sure of the answer of. What I think is the case, based on the past, is that there's no requirement to go to Parliament, and that it's a decision of a group of ministers, or even just the Prime Minister. It's our wonderful, loose, no constitution that we have. I'm pretty sure that's the answer.
Mike's just gone to the bathroom, so I'll take the next question.
Hi, kia ora, Alistair Duncan. Thank you, panel. I was in Vilnius 10 days ago, and next to the KFC ads, there are giant NATO ads with doe-eyed children looking at desperately handsome Nordic people who happen to be wearing uniforms. And I talked to a few people there, and I'm concerned that the Prime Minister, who clearly is a bit busy to respond, is going to come back from Vilnius, having had 5 minutes with Zelensky and probably 10 seconds with Biden, and he will be thinking, gosh, we need to be doing something in the Indo-Pacific. Now, Nikki made the point early on that probably most MPs aren't thinking about it, but the Minister of Defence, Andrew Little. And if his record as Minister of Defence is as effective as his Minister of Health, then we're all in trouble. Any comments from the panel about whether this is going to be on the fringe of some election issues?
My comment about NATO, as we know, which is happening at the moment, is that, the Asia-Pacific Four are there, and the members that would be part of an AUKUS, quote, Pillar 2. So I think that if you have time, you should OAA about briefings and whatnot and see what discussions were had, because they're not being told. We're only told that he didn't get to see Zelensky. And maybe he has to work a bit harder, eh? Yeah. It's shocking. And so instead he comes back from that with this great snub. And the response presumably is not to then say, wait a second, they don't give a shit about us down here. They just want us as a battleground. No, it's not what's happening. Do you have any comment about NATO? We were prepared at the start of this week or last week when Geoffrey Miller wrote a piece talking about New Zealand prepares to embrace NATO plus. I think that we should ask questions about that too.
I think if no one had spoken up at all, and there'd been no debate and no pushback, and there's been a lot of pushbacks, starting with Jim Bolger and Helen Clark, and all these people have been speaking up across the spectrum. But if there hadn't been a reaction, I think we could be in AUKUS very quickly. As it stands, I don't think anything will happen before the election, so the next 3 months are clear, and then the battle will resume again. That's what I think.
Yeah, take the mic.
Is there any political party in New Zealand that is against this treaty?
I think the Māori Party ruled it out, saying that they want to be Switzerland of the South Pacific. The Green Party have asked questions in Parliament, but have not committed to it. If we look at the odds, we probably think the best case in terms of parliamentary politics at locking it out would be a Māori Greens Labour alliance, coalition. But we're currently in a situation where it's not currently an election issue, and as Nikki described, the function by which this becomes policy is not part of electoral politics. It's part of covert, behind-the-scenes ministerial relations. Yeah, and potentially lobbying by overseas military companies and whatnot. We've seen that happen a lot in Australia. I don't know if anyone's doing any work on this in the New Zealand context, who the actual lobbyists for this are. Yeah.
But can I add? This is such a fantastically bad idea to be part of an ill-thought-out coalition of countries against China, that we shouldn't be despondent. We shouldn't think that it's hopeless. Even if there's a change of government, we shouldn't think it's hopeless, because it's such a bad idea. And so I'd really recommend, don't think, oh God, they always get their way. There will be a fight. The fight won't be Jerry Brownlee or Chris Hipkins or whatever. It will be about foreign affairs and how much influence they can get behind the scenes. But the more it's public, every letter to the editor that one of us writes, every time we speak to someone, whatever we do on this, we make it less likely to happen. I think that things are stacked against it happening. It's such a bad idea. And its best hope of going through is by being invisible and being too late by the time people realize. But if people do write those letters to the editor and do talk about it and do talk to the MP and so on, then I think we've got a good chance of stopping it.
Well, I'd just like to add to that. We are proudly nuclear free, and that didn't happen by accident, and that didn't happen because people did something about it. I mean, I remember sailing around the Truxton on its entry into Wellington Harbour. There's probably plenty of others in here who marched and worked and supported and turned us into a country that is firmly opposed to nuclear weapons, to the point where the government cannot go back on it now. So I don't think it's not. I think Nikki's absolutely right. This is such a terrible idea. It's giving us a fantastic opportunity to start to speak up for peace. And that is where I think this argument should ultimately go. And on that note, I think I'll say a few things before I conclude, because I've got a few points to make too. The first is that people have talked about, I agree absolutely with what our excellent presenters have said, about AUKUS is fundamentally an anti-China alliance. And there's been talk about China is arming itself, and it is. And there's a reason why. Because in 1842, 2 years after the Treaty of Waitangi was signed in New Zealand between the British government and the Indigenous Maori, the Treaty of Nanjing was signed, which assigned Hong Kong to Britain and forced the Chinese to pay forced to be paid for their silks and ceramics and things the West wanted in opium, the so-called Opium War. And if we think of the history of the relationship between us Pākehā and Indigenous people in New Zealand, that we have had to work out a very contentious history, and through a civil war come to some understandings of what is a very powerful and in many ways much superior culture to the one I grew up in. That's the first thing. So that memory is locked hard into the consciousness of people in China. The second thing is, we like to talk about how our foreign policy is value-based, and we make a lot of our liberal individual values, and occasionally whānau boast indigenous Maori values. China is a 2,000 at least year old civilization and has a value set of its own, which is in many ways has many elements that are superior to ours. I was fortunate to interview the Chinese ambassador Wang Xiaolong a few months ago, and the interview is up on the Fabian Society website on YouTube about China's values, and you can go there and have a look at what he said, because I think it's important that if we want to talk about values, we have to understand the values of other cultures. And if we want to understand the values of other cultures, we have to listen to them, tell us what they are, not us tell them what they are. And the final thing I want to say is this. In 2002, I was at a conference in Ottawa in Canada, and I was watching American television in my hotel room. And it was a conference about the NDP and the unions. And I came back to the caucus. I was the Labour Party General Secretary at the time, and I reported to the caucus about the conference. And then I said, oh, by the way, the Americans are going to invade Iraq, because I'd been watching the television and it was just so obvious they were going to invade Iraq. And Helen Clark got up immediately and said, well, I can tell you one thing, we're not going with them, which I was very glad to hear. But the point I want to make about that is, when you see a media that becomes convergent in its condemnation of a culture, that is a sign that it is headed on the way to war. And so I think the other motivation for a campaign that is being waged against AUKUS and needs to be waged against AUKUS is to say we do not want to go to war with China. It would be a disaster. Fortunately, I'll probably be gone by that time, so I'm just giving the rest of you a warning. Okay, with that, whawhātai lava, ngā mihi nui, thank you very much, Nikki and Arama and Marco, and thank you all for coming. And one last thing. Our last presentation was by Dr. Tim Beale about its title, and there's a paper here, there are some left hopefully, Weaponizing Europe, Counting Eurasia, Mackinder, Brzezinski, Newland, and the Road to the Ukraine War, which is a brilliant exposition of the heartland theory and the reasons that have led up to that disastrous event as well. So if there are some left, please take them. You can find also Tim's lecture on our website. So thank you very much, everybody. Sorry, yes, of course. Oh my dear. Time for karakia to round us off. Thank you, Tawhina.
Just before I do karakia, there's a poem written outside by the kitchen that I thought was very pertinent to the kōrero. And in all this kōrero, I think one thing that my focus on in the nuclear free and independent Pacific movement, which this is an iteration of, is the need for independence in the Pacific. And part of that is honouring te tiriti and he whakaputanga in our everyday lives. So I'll just say this poem and then finish off in a karakia. And this poem's called Hawaiki, which is very relevant to today's kōrero, this evening's kōrero. Okay. And this poem is by Te Tibu in her book, I think it's, Pahuta Contas, which is probably sold downstairs at Unity Books. My mother, tired from pregnancy and being alive, named her last son Hawaiki, like the paradise. Some people say it is where we go when we die. They say we dive straight off the edge of Cape Reinga and into the point where the sky hangs so heavy with spirits that it touches the sea. Other people say that is where we were before we came here, by waka or whale, or perhaps that was where we were before there was anything at all, where we meant something before we discovered, like Eve, God's forbidden fruit in the shape of an eye. I think it must be a womb where everything is born and returns to. Life and death are the colour red. They are the colour of a cosmic heartbeat rising on his flesh, baby flesh, pinched between fingers and kissed. And I'll finish off with our karakia. Te umuti rama nuku te umuti rama rangi ko koe kei wetikia nōtia e koe. Whiwhi o ngākau o mahara kia puta ki te whai ao ki te ao mārama. Tēnei te umu ka eke, nā te umu o enei kōrero, nā te umu o enei tangata, ka mā ngā koro mātua, ka mā hoki tēnei tangata. Turu turu o whiti whakamaua kia tīna, haumi e hui e, tā e ki e. Kia ora mai tātou.